Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to turn this Flowerform vase. I got the idea from the vase from the turn of the century Loetz art glass vase, and I liked it so much that I thought, let me try to see if I can make that out of wood. I turned it green, which means that I cut the log from the tree, turned it right away because I wanted it to warp, so that it gives it a natural flow. It's not completely symmetrical because it's trying to imitate nature. And so I did my best at trying to imitate nature in the piece. And we'll see as it dries further, it will probably warp and bend, and the stem might become a little crooked. And we may even see a little bit of that on the lathe. So let's get going.
The first step was to make sure we got all the bark off and true up the blank. I'm using a spindle gouge to do the initial roughing. The piece is green, so there isn't a dust, and the bark is flying off, as you can see. It's almost trued up and ready for shaping. I don't want to take off too much of the sapwood because it's a nice white color which contrasts against the mulberry inside. So later on when we get the final turning and we see some layers, it'll look much nicer. The light in the shop is kind of yellowish, so you really can't see the good contrast, but you can sort of see it here as the mulberry in the center is showing through the white sapwood. The next step is to measure out the rough dimensions and mark up the log. I'm really not using anything but my eye here. I mean, you see a ruler eventually, but it's just a guide. I do use a tape measure. I'm trying to find the center because I'm going to, in between the foot and the goblet end of the vase, there's going to be a little bump which indicates a part of the plant. I'm not sure what it's called, but we're going to try to put that in, and I probably will ignore those marks later once I get the foot turned. But I am going to mark off here for a tenon, which is going to go into my long nose chuck. The next thing I'm going to do is turn a tenon. We need to hollow out the other end, and that means it can't be between centers, so we need to mount it in my long nose chuck. Once I've got the tenon down to size, I use a skew chisel just to level it out and square up the end. Alright, there's the tenon all ready to go. Now we got to get it chucked up in the long nose chuck. So we'll put that on the machine. And then we'll be ready for hollowing. Okay, the next step is to mount a steady rest. The most dangerous thing you can do on the lathe is hollow end grain on a very long piece. So we're going to put a steady rest in, and that will help support it so we can not have an accident. After testing the steady rest, I realized it's going to have to be a little bit wider to fit in, so I just took some more off on each side to get the knobs that hold the bearings in place to be able to fit. Alright, it took a bit of work, but I got my steady rest installed, and now we're ready to start hollowing out the other side. First, I'm going to do a little bit of shaping on the outside so I know how to shape the inside. And if you notice, I left the tenon or the race where the steady rest is all lined up. We left that a little wider than the flower vase is going to be at the end, because those bearings mark up the wood. They should be made out of rubber, but they chose to make them out of metal, so rubber feet would have been rubber bearings, rubber wheels would have been a much better choice on the steady rest. Okay, next step is to hollow out the inside. Now, I usually use Forstner bit mounted in a Jacob's chuck just to get the initial drilling done. It's a lot safer than putting a gouge on there or a scraper, and it gets the job done, takes off a lot of material very quickly. Notice here I'm squirting it with a water bottle, and that's just to keep that heat down. You can see the steam and smoke rising. That gets very hot and will lose its temper, and so it won't cut very well if you let it get too hot. Alright, and now we can do a little more shaping and hollowing. I want to first give the lip some definition, so we start there, and then we'll hollow out the inside and get it to the right depth. Now I'm going to check the wall thickness using calipers. I want this to be rather thin because, like I said earlier, I want the green wood as it dries to take on the natural shape that it would, because there's stresses built into the wood. So I'm going to try to get this pretty thin. And I have a penchant for walking in front of the camera, so if you see my back now and then, just ignore it. I reshaped that lip a little bit because it had some cracks in it, and I noticed that the inside and where I'm scraping the wood, it's getting very stringy, and so I'd rather be cutting, but just on that inside it's very narrow, tight diameter, so we're going to go ahead and use sandpaper to get rid of that stringiness. Alright, I'm happy with the inside for now, and so we're going to go ahead and do some final shaping on the outside before we take off the steady rest. Since I'm going to be turning this very thin, the stem of this vase very thin, I want to be able to support the piece between centers again. So I created a little jam chuck to put in so I could pull my tailstock up, and that will hold it and give it the security I need while I'm working on shaping the very thin center column. Alright, now I can shape the vase and the stem and the bead and the foot, and that way the whole thing will start to take some shape, and that's the really satisfying part of watching the work happen. I'm using a caliper here to gauge the depth of this. I want the spindle to be about 3/4 of an inch. And actually, I go down to a half, and I'm still not happy at the end with the width. I think it needs to be much more delicate than the final piece comes out. Once again, I'm trying to mark out the center of that shaft between the bulb of the vase and the foot, and then leave a half on either side so I can round off this bulb in the middle. And now you'll notice a wobble in the shaft, and that's because we had a little catch, which you can see on the bulb in the center, and that has thrown off the alignment of the jam chuck, and so the whole thing is now wobbling according to the warp in it. So we sanded it up a little bit, tried to get rid of that catch that was showing. You'll see a crack in the wood. That's in the pith layer of the log, and we're going to have to fill that with some epoxy. And that's a natural crack. It's not something that we caused, but it was there in the wood all the time. So I'm going to put the epoxy in, and I'll push that into the crack, and hopefully we'll sand that off. Now the reason it's warped is not because we had a catch, but the warp is from the wood drying out and relieving the natural stresses that are in the grain. So when we take the jam chuck off, you'll see it wobble a lot. There's nothing we can do about that at this point. The project is in its third day, even though it's been 20 minutes on the video, and because we took so much time, the wood has had a chance to move.
Okay, I'm back. We're all turned. We've got a coat of sanding sealer on there. We've got some epoxy in the cracks that were in the pith layer. And now we just have to sand it up to 400, and then we'll figure out what kind of finish we're going to do. So let's get going.
All right, there's that wobble I was talking about. I did sand it up a little bit on the inside, but I didn't show that. We sanded from the base up, and then I'm going to put the jam chuck back in just to get it going centered again and running true. Alright, I've sanded it up to 220, but we're going to go to 400. But the next two grits, I'm going to put on some linseed oil, and we'll sand wet. That'll keep the very fine dust down in the shop, which is always a concern, and that'll give me a little look as to what the grain is going to look like. And you can see the heartwood and the sapwood contrasting with each other there in a little circle in the grain. Very nice. Well, it's all sanded up, and now it's time to part it off the lathe. I'm going to do a little more finish sanding.
All right, the machining part of it is done, but it still needs a little bit more work. It needs some hand sanding. The bottom needs to be finished because we just cut that off the lathe. The inside needs to be sanded a little bit more because we used green wood so that as it dried it would warp and give more of a natural look to it. But because of that, it made it more difficult to sand. And so I'm going to have to do that by hand, which we're not going to show. But once that work is done, I'll take some nice pictures and we'll put them up at the end of the video. All right, please check back.